Good evening, everyone. The talk will start in about 5 minutes' time. Good evening, everyone. We're just doing a sound check before the talk starts in a couple of minutes. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our latest talk in our series of Wednesday evening presentations. My name is John Hughes. As you can see, I'm from Shropshire Wildlife Trust. Shropshire Wildlife Trust is all about conserving the great diversity of wildlife. But this evening, I want to talk to you about one particular area of wildlife.
Wait for it.
Wait for it. And that's fungi, mushrooms and toadstools. What you can see around at the moment, coming up in lawns and in woodlands, are the autumn flush of fungi. It's something I've been interested in for, gosh, about 40 years now, something like that. And I do walks and talks. And I find that I get asked all sorts of questions. And they tend to be the same questions. The problem is they're the wrong questions. So what I really want to try and do this evening is pose and answer some of those questions that I think you really ought to be asking me. So here we go. So those questions you've never dared ask. So already I've got you confused, I know that. What is this idiot rambling on about? Well, let me give you an example of the sort of question that I would like to be asked. So that's my idea of a good question. I just wonder if you have ever seen a wolf's fart. I know I have. I'm guessing you probably like to see one now. So let's have a look at one, shall we? There we go. So that is a wolf's fart. That's a little thing called an earth star, a bit like a puffball. And if you were French, you would call that a veste de loup, which is roughly translated as a wolf's fart. And that absolutely perfectly shows what mushrooms and toadstools are all about. So you go out into the woods and you'll see all sorts of different colours, shapes, sizes. Wonderful display of grassland fungi there. You'll also see things like this cup fungi. They're around now. I saw some at the weekend. Particularly you'll see these in the spring. But they're all the same thing. They are all fruit. They are only there to produce seeds. And with fungi we don't call them seeds, we call them spores. And here's my perfect example of the structure of a fungus, what it's all about. So you get a big tall stem. On the top of that you get a cap. Under that you have the gills. The spores drop out of the gills. They get caught by the wind currents and they're dispersed. However, if you're a cup fungus sitting on the ground, the air down there doesn't move around very much. So what cup fungi do is they shoot their spores into the air. Under the power of water, they shoot them into the air current, and lo and behold, your spores are dispersed. And in a nutshell, that is precisely what mushrooms and toadstools are all about. It's very, very simple. They are fruit. They are there to produce seeds, to disperse those seeds, and to continue that species. So, let's have another question. Did mushrooms rule the earth? Well, what we know is that dinosaurs ruled the earth. What about mushrooms though? Well, maybe. So there we go. That's a clipping from a newspaper from about, 20 odd years ago, I think. And it's all about this lady who saw this big white thing in a field, thought it was a sheep in trouble, went to investigate, and it turned out to be a giant puffball. Giant puffballs are around at the moment. I picked one today, but it wasn't as giant as that, unfortunately. So, here's a little girl who's the niece of one of my colleagues, and you can see in her hand she is holding a fairly typical cap mushroom. And I wonder if anybody out there has any idea how many spores that mushroom may contain. Yeah, I can't hear you. You'll have to shout louder than that. I'm going to tell you in that case. So that mushroom, which is what, sort of 4 or 5 inches across, will contain something in the order of 16 billion spores. And when it's producing spores at its height, so it changes through its life cycle, but it will be producing at a maximum about 100 million spores per hour. So it's huge, massive numbers of spores that it's producing. So let's go back to our old friend, the giant puffball. Here we are. A lady is holding one there. She should have worn a different coloured jumper so we could see it better. How many spores are going to be in that? If we had 16 billion in that relatively small mushroom, what about this giant football-sized puffball? Well, that will contain something like 7,000 billion spores. Massive numbers of spores. And of course, the way that mushrooms and toadstools are working is they take the opposite end of the spectrum from what we do as a species, and we produce very small numbers of offspring, invest in them heavily, and they thrive. With fungi, what they do is produce billions of potential fungi, and relatively small numbers of them thrive. Now, if all those 7,000 billion spores were to germinate and produce another puffball, what you would have is puffballs going round the earth 5 times. And then, if all of those puffballs that produce 7,000 billion spores were to germinate each of their spores and produce another puffball, what you'd have is puffballs weighing 800 times the weight of the Earth. So you can see that the potential is there for fungi to rule the Earth. But of course, that's not how they work. It's very small percentage of their spores that actually fall somewhere where they're able to grow and then do grow. So I'm sure you will have seen things like this. So this is a fairy ring fungus. It's actually called fairy ring mushroom. And they grow in rings, they grow on lawns. And one of the nice things about them is they can you can approximately date them. So the process is a spore will land and it will send out white threads growing in every direction, and as long as it's finding food, it will carry on growing as a circle, and it will expand at round about 6 inches a year. It really depends on the weather conditions, but work on 6 inches diameter additional a year, and that means you can measure it and work out approximately how old it is. So that's quite interesting, isn't it? So if you've got one of those growing on your lawn, you can not only work out how long it's been there, but how long before it will leave your lawn. Good stuff. Oh, there you go. That's just to show that fairies do actually sit on toadstools. So this mushroom here is a thing called honey fungus, which you may well have heard of. And honey fungus grows on trees, it grows in woodlands, and if you're measuring a ring in a field, that's very easy. But actually, if you're in a woodland and you try and measure a ring, it's very difficult because there's trees in the way. So you might see one toadstool over there, one over there. Are they part of the same ring? Aren't they? Who knows? And we really didn't know just how big some of these rings were until the 1990s, when we really started to develop genetic fingerprinting. And with genetic fingerprinting, we were able to test those mushrooms and see if they were part of the same organism. And actually, what was discovered in woodlands this was in the USA, that they were huge. Some of these organisms were absolutely massive, and I think they got to about 50 kilometres across. So just think about that for a minute, an organism that's 50 kilometres across. So what that means is that honey fungus is probably the biggest, oldest, heaviest living thing on Earth. Now, there's no proof of that. You know it's very big. You really don't know how old it is because you can't carbon date it or anything like that because its threads are constantly growing and dying off. You can't weigh it because you'd have to dig up the whole woodland and constantly be testing to work out if you've got the same bits of organism. But take my word for it, they are very, very big indeed. So they have this amazing potential to rule the earth. Now, it's a good job if they get that big. You know, we've all seen the monster movies. It's a good job they don't move about, but of course some of them do. So this wonderful thing that you're looking at here is it's something that you'll see all over the place. Actually, this was obviously taken in a woodland. I took this in a local woodland, and it's a thing that's lovingly known as dog sick. It's not actually dog sick. What it is, if you cast your mind back to being at school and studying biology, you will have learnt about the amoeba, which is a single-celled creature. It's an animal, single-celled animal, moves around, finds food, moves away from stimuli it doesn't like, and this is an amoeba. And this particular amoeba is going through part of its life cycle where it congregates and produces these great big what appear to be organisms, and you will see it around if you look. Now this is a different one, same thing, different one. So the picture on the left where it's white, if you prodded that it would be rather squidgy. But leave it a few days and it became the thing on the right where it's brown. And actually, if you were to just give that a scrape and a blow, a cloud of dust would come off it. But it's not dust, it's spores. So hang on, it's an amoeba, but it's producing spores. Well, what you're looking at here is a creature that's known as a slime mold, which is part animal, part fungus. And actually, in the evolutionary tree, it branches off between fungi and between animals. So it has the characteristics of both. So do look out for slime molds. They're amazing things, absolutely astonishing. And they are everywhere. If you go around with your eyes open, you will see them all over the place. Right, this is your time to shine. So, I want you to shout out, please. So what I'm going to show you are some mushrooms that you found when you're marooned on a desert island, and there's nothing else to eat, and you're going to have to decide whether you're going to eat these or not. So let's have a look. What's that? Say no. Oh, someone said yes. So someone is absolutely correct. So look closely at this one, and what you'll see is underneath it hasn't got gills like a normal mushroom. It's got little spines, and this is a thing called a hedgehog mushroom. And these are absolutely delicious. If you were a fancy French chef, you would call these pieds de mouton, sheep's foot, but they're really, really nutty and lovely things to eat. What about this one? Are you going to eat this one? Yeah. Oh, someone says they've eaten one of these. So this is a lovely thing called the Shaggy Ink Cap. And the picture on the left is when they are reasonably good to eat. They're white, ever so common. You'll see these roadsides, you'll see them in parks, you'll see them in fields. But they start off this lovely white colour, and over time they become black and inky, like the picture on the right hand side. And if we go back to my starting point, it's all about the spores, it's all about producing seed. And Shaggy Ink Caps, instead of dropping their spores into the wind to be dispersed, they digest themselves, and the spores come out in this black inky liquid, and it drops to the ground, and it rains, and the rain washes it away, and so it disperses the spores. So again, they're quite good to eat. They're very delicately flavoured, shall we put it. I don't think they have much flavour. It's not one I would tend to bother with, but they are perfectly edible. What about this one? Trompette des Morts, trumpets of death. Yeah, yes, eat it. This is a fabulous one. The ones I'm showing you at the moment, very difficult to confuse with anything else for the most part. Horn of plenty, we call these in common parlance in English. Where you find them in woodlands, under beech or under oak, you will often find huge numbers of them, and they're actually really, really nice to eat. They're trumpets of death because they're black, they're death coloured, and they're hollow. They have this hollow stem, so they look like little trumpets, but they're actually really, really good to eat. And again, if you watch chefy programs on the telly, they will talk about trompette, and this is what they're talking about. Okay, so what about this one? Looks a bit like a brain. What's not to like? And this is actually one that comes up in the springtime. So this is a thing called a morel. And morels are very, very highly prized, extremely expensive to buy if you find them in a delicatessen. But like all these pictures, they're all found. So this one was taken up near Oswestry in Shropshire. So they're all local. Everything I'm showing you is local. None of it is coming from abroad. It's all to be found in your local woodlands. So this, as I say, is called a morel, and they're generally delicious. The only issue with them is because of their structure, they do tend to be a little bit full of grit and earwigs and various things like that. So you either have to clean them thoroughly or not be too bothered. This one, shall we go with this one? I like the look of this one. So this is one that I've no doubt you'll have heard of. This is a thing called the Chanterelle. The photo makes it look enormous. They're not quite as big as houses, but they are out and about now. I found a few of these at the weekend. They tend to come quite early in the autumn. Late summer, early autumn is when the fungi start to emerge. And as I say, this is a chanterelle, and again, they're quite closely related to the trompettes, the horn of plenty. And when you find them, you can find them in immense profusion. And just to prove that, here's me with a basket of them. That's from a couple of years ago, and that was from a local woodland. But if you go to places like Scotland, for example, there's just huge quantities of them. And again, all these fungi I'm showing you are actually, they're quite difficult to confuse with anything that's going to kill you. And even when you've got things that are similar, so you've got a thing called a false chanterelle that can cause stomach upsets, it's actually, you've only got to learn two things. And you'll know them, and you'll know the difference between them, and it's really quite straightforward. Here's a nice one. This is probably my very favourite. So this is in English, its common name is a penny bun. If you're French, you would call that a cep. Italians call them porcini, little pigs. Steinpilz in German. Absolutely delicious to eat, probably the tastiest mushroom. And again, look underneath the cap and you'll see it hasn't got gills. If you were able to zoom in closely on my picture, you'd see it has little pores, looks like a sponge, and that puts it in the Boletus family. And all Boletus have these sort of spongy underneath, and not all Boletus are edible. Many of them are. There's one or two that won't do you much good. But again, they're actually really quite easy to be able to tease them out and to identify. So I'm showing you ones that are quite easy to identify. And mushrooms, if you're a beginner learning about mushrooms, picking mushrooms to eat is a really good way to get going, because you can say, I want to eat these 4 mushrooms, and I need to identify them, but I need to identify maybe another 8 that look like them. So you've only got to identify 12 mushrooms, rather than there are, there are something like 4,000 different species of large mushrooms in Britain. So you'll never remember all those. 12 you stand a chance of remembering. So and you need to get it right if you're going to eat them. So what about this one? Well, this is quite an interesting one. If you remember, we had the Shaggy Ink Cap that was white, and you can see from this photo that at the bottom of the cap it's starting to go a bit inky. And this is also an ink cap, but this one is common ink cap, and it's got this greyish colour to it. It's not the pure white of the Shaggy Ink Cap, and very often they're in tight groups, and this is one that you will see pushing up through pavements. I've seen them pushing up through tarmac. They're recorded as breaking paving slabs. Amazing power. But the interesting thing about this one is it's perfectly edible. However, if you consume alcohol within a couple of days either side of eating this, you will be quite ill. So it reacts in your system with the alcohol and makes you feel nauseous. And actually, recovering alcoholics are treated with a substance that's called antabuse, that's synthesized from the chemical that occurs in this mushroom. So if you're going to pick ink caps, make sure you've got Shaggy ink caps, not common ink caps. You might regret it. This is one of my favourite mushrooms, absolute corker. Are we going to eat it? No, we are not. So just have a close look at this one. So you'll see that it's beautiful colour on the top, and you can see there are sort of white patches there, and then go down to the base of the stem and you'll see sort of shaggy material around the base, and what you've got there is also the other thing to note is the white gills and the ring around the stem. But the absolute key thing on this is that sac. So the whole mushroom, when it was small, was contained within a sac, and as it expanded it burst out of that sac, and at the base of the stem you can see the remains of it, this fleshy sac, and on the top of the cap you can see the remains of the sac, those white bits. And the reason I'm labouring this one a little bit is this is a death cap, and the vast majority of fatal poisonings that are caused throughout Europe by people eating fungi and mistakenly eating fungi are caused by death cap. So this thing is maybe 4 or 5 inches across on the cap, something like that, but that is sufficient to kill probably 4 or 5 people, something like that. However, interestingly, typically if 4 people ate a chunk of this, only 2 of you would die. 2 would survive. Your liver and kidneys would be shot, but you wouldn't be dead. You'd be on dialysis, I'm afraid. So do look out for this one. It's not very common. It's a really pretty mushroom. I see it most years if I go looking for it. Occasionally I found it in profusion, but not very often. So do have a look for this, and do treat it with the respect it deserves, but do admire its beauty. It really is a very wonderful mushroom indeed. So how did you do on the quiz? How many of those did you eat? Are you dead? Are you living? Are you suffering from poison because you've had too much alcohol? We will find out later. So let's get back to my questions. Right, these are the questions that nobody dare ask. I always like Top Cat. Everybody can sing the theme tune to Top Cat, and I can hear some of you singing it now, so that's great. But Officer Dibble. So, here's you get all sorts of things that have the face of Elvis or Jesus or whoever in them. This is an apple with the face of, I'm not quite sure who that is. You can decide. But what you can see there are fungal diseases in the apple. And what I've been talking about so far are larger fungi. But I'm just moving on a little bit here to microscopic fungi, because the fungi that are economically important, they tend to be the ones that either we're able to use. So yeast is a microscopic fungus, and without yeast we wouldn't have bread, we wouldn't have alcohol. Penicillin is another one that we've been able to harness, but an awful lot of microscopic fungi cause diseases. And here's an apple that's got fungal diseases on it. So there you can see my potatoes from a couple of years ago, and you'll hopefully recognise those as potato leaves, but what you can see are little blackish grey blotches on them. And I get that pretty much every year on my potatoes, and that's potato blight. And it comes in on the rain, and it lands on the potato leaves, and it infects the leaves. The leaves will eventually die off. They produce spores. Spores fall to the ground, and it can then get into the potato tubers and make them very, very difficult to store. And these days, with modern agriculture, potatoes are sprayed. Potatoes are preventatively sprayed. They're not sprayed when blight is on them. They're sprayed before blight is likely to get on them. So it's always nice to know that you're eating a few chemicals with your chips, isn't it? But I grow my potatoes organically. I dig them up, I store them. I actually very seldom have problems storing them. But when you get very heavy infestations of blight, it really is a problem. And in Ireland, in the middle of the 19th century, there was this tremendous outbreak of potato blight. Came in from Europe, came into Ireland, and the issue in Ireland was that the population there were using potatoes as their staple food. It was actually pretty much the only food they were eating. And one of the really interesting things with potatoes is they actually, if you eat them with their skins, they contain all the vitamins and minerals you need to survive. So people were surviving on pretty much a diet solely of potatoes. But what you had between 1845 and 1849 was a whole series of summers when potato blight struck, and that meant not only did the poor people of Ireland have nothing to eat during the winter, but they then had no seed potato, so it just exacerbated. So over this 5-year period, there was this sort of massive decline in the population of Ireland. So in 1845, population of 8 million. 1 million of those died from starvation, 1 million emigrated, and of those million that emigrated, round about 250,000 then died from malnutrition because they'd had so little food to eat. So you can see it had this massive impact. And 1 million people emigrated. Where did they go? Well, Irish people did as they've always done. They went all over the world, and many came to Britain, all sorts of other countries, Australia, but an awful lot of them went to the USA. And you're talking about a population who were largely illiterate. So they'd been agricultural labourers, and they moved out to the US. They couldn't read and write, so they found it actually very difficult to progress in society. So they came in as the sort of low-level we would have called them navvies if they'd come into Britain, digging the navigations, so building the railways, doing work like that. But there was one way that Irish people, illiterate Irish people, were able to progress in society, and that was to join the police force, because you didn't need to be highly educated. All you needed to be able to do was knock a few heads together, and they were sort of quite good at that. So in the mid 1840s, of course, what happened was Officer Dibble's granddad came over to the US, and to this day you will still see the reference of Irish policemen in the USA. So think about something like the Fairy Tale of New York. The boys of the NYPD choir were singing Galway Bay. It's all to do with fungi. It's all to do with potato blight and people having to emigrate out of Ireland. Okay, let's have another question. So, what did give Rudolph his red nose? So, this is a tiny little grassland fungus, and it's very, very common, and you will get it in all sorts of places, particularly where you've got high nitrogen levels because you've had something like sheep grazing and they dung and they wee everywhere and the nitrogen levels build up, and this little fungus likes to grow there. And you can see that it's got this bell-shaped cap to it with a little pimple on the top. And this is a thing called Psilocybe semilanceata, better known as liberty caps, or even better known as magic mushrooms. So this contains a toxin that if you consume it, it affects your central nervous system and causes mild hallucinations. This is a Class A drug, by the way, so don't go out picking it. So what about this one? So just hark back to the death cap I showed you a little while ago, and that had the remains of the sack it was contained in. So I'm sure you've seen this one around. You'll have seen it around birch trees. Anywhere you get birch trees, you're likely to get this. And the white spots on the top of this red mushroom are again part of a sac it was contained within. The mushroom expands, the sac stays on the top. And this is a lovely mushroom, closely related to the death cap. This is called fly agaric, and it gets its name from a medieval practice of collecting the mushroom when it comes out in the autumn. You dry it, and then in the summer months, when it goes hot and you're plagued with flies, you crumble it into milk, and it's meant to be a fly repellent. So fly agaric, this one is called. But it's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because if you ask anybody to draw a picture of a toadstool, it's this one that they will draw, and you see it appearing in all sorts of places. You see it associated with fairy tales and nursery rhymes. Why on earth should that be? Well, it's pretty straightforward, to be honest. I showed you the magic mushrooms and I said they were mildly hallucinogenic. This is very powerfully hallucinogenic. Definitely not one to eat. It has the potential to kill you. So definitely don't eat that. But it's not a Class A drug, unlike the magic mushrooms. And it's associated with fairy stories, with myths. You will see it in everything from Jack and the Beanstalk, where Jack goes off and swaps the cow for magic beans. He brings them home, his mother thrashes him soundly, sends him to bed with no supper. The beans are thrown out of the window, and in the morning there is a giant beanstalk that's popped up just like a toadstool does, very, very rapidly. Jack climbs up it. What does he find? He finds giants, he finds geese laying golden eggs, singing harps, things like that. Hallucinations, essentially. And you will see that passing through literature and myth, right through to things like eat me, Alice gets big, drink me, Alice gets small. And one of its features, if you consume it, is it changes your perception of size. So Alice wasn't getting big, Alice wasn't getting small, her perception of size of the things around her was changing. But this is a mushroom that has been used for its narcotic properties all over the world wherever it occurs. And as I say, it grows with birch, it grows with pine. So if you go to the northern climes, you will find an awful lot of this, and it's certainly been used there for its narcotic properties. So Siberian nomads are a really great example of this. So reindeer herders, they would follow the herds of reindeer around in the spring and summer. In the autumn and winter, they would settle down and build fairly crude shelters made out of reindeer skins. So it would have been a wooden framework and a simple door that acted as a smoke hole as well. And it would have been the shaman, the holy men of the tribe, who were consuming these mushrooms to enable them to go and commune with the gods and bring back messages. So you sort of put all these things together, don't you? And what do you get? You get this old man, the shaman, who's in a merry mood because of what he's been eating. And he wears the colours of the mushrooms that he's been eating. And he comes in through the smoke hole, doesn't he? And of course the reindeer are flying, and he is flying because of what he's been eating. So who do we end up with? There we go. So I'm going to end this with one final question. So you can see me hopefully on the screen or on part of the screen. So what am I going to look like in 20 years' time? Well, that's a really good question. Now, as I said, I've been interested in mushrooms and toadstools for about 40 years. And the study of mushrooms and toadstools is known as mycology. So I'm a mycologist, and there is a very old saying that I made up a couple of years ago, which is that old mycologists never die, they just lose their fashion sense. And the gentleman that you can see there with his trousers tucked into his socks and the beret is a hero of mine. And if you, like me, own a very old copy, and I mean very old copy, probably now going back 25, 30 years at least, of the Collins Guide to Mushrooms and Toadstools, this was the gentleman that wrote it. So this is Dr. Bayard Hora, who I was lucky enough to know and be associated with. He was a botany professor at Reading University, and he was a great man, and he was fabulous to hang around, and I was able to pick up so many tips from him on identifying mushrooms and just the sheer passion that he had for mushrooms. Absolutely great man, but long dead now, sadly. But I model myself on him. So there you go. I now have the beret, which is a really good starting point. But my question was, what am I going to look like in 20 years' time? Well, fairly obviously, I'm going to look like a mushroom, and I know which mushroom I'm going to look like. And it's this one. And there's good reasons why I'm going to look like this mushroom. So it's a bit of a Shropshire speciality, this one. It grows in the valley of the River Severn, and I find it every year in my local woods. really, really fabulous, isn't it? Also, one of the things that I've always had, my superpower, if you will, my ability, has been to remember Latin names for things. I struggle with people's names, but I can remember the Latin names for fungi and plants and things like that with great alacrity. And this has one of my favourite Latin names. It's called Strobilomyces floccopus. It's actually changed its name, but I absolutely refuse to change because I just think its name is so beautiful. Strobilomyces floccopus. But it also has a common English name, and it is the Old Man of the Woods. And in 20 years' time, I think that will be me. So, thank you very much to everybody for watching this talk and listening in. I would urge everybody out there, if they've not already done so, to join Shropshire Wildlife Trust, and do remember that we have these talks on a weekly basis, and throughout the month of September where our theme is going to be rivers, and our rivers team will be talking about all aspects of the Severn and its tributaries and interesting things about rivers and their wildlife. So please join us in the future, and thank you very much for listening. And we will just see if any questions have come in. Yeah, I've got a few questions, so I will try and answer those.
Does slime mould have intelligence? Why is a trumpet of death so cool?
Do slime moulds have intelligence? I do work with a few slime moulds, it's true. So slime moulds are really, really interesting things, and they have been used in fascinating ways to plan out transport systems, because they can find the quickest way around. All they're looking for is food, so they will put out threads and they will find this food. Whether that's intelligence, I don't know. I think that depends how you define intelligence, but they are certainly incredibly well adapted at what they do, and they have this tremendous niche in nature that they can exploit just par excellence, nothing else like them. And I think it's, we are very good at exploiting our niche in nature. We tend to take it a little bit too far. Slime moulds, I don't think, will ever do that. They will, as we will, be limited by their food ultimately. So I don't know. So trumpet of death. Why is it called? Why is it called trumpet of death? That's what the French call it, trompette des morts. We call them horn of plenty, but you can see the reason why. Excuse me, and that's because they're black and they are trumpet shaped. So black is the colour of death, and they look like a trumpet. Simple as.
Question from Alison Curran. Why don't you record your fungi finds on any database in order to further knowledge?
So the question was about recording fungi finds. I occasionally record fungi finds. I found, particularly when I am running walks, which is most of my fungiing is out with people. I found it. I've tried to record as I've gone along, and I found it very, very difficult. And frankly, I've given up doing it. It's maybe something I will start doing again, particularly when I retire.
Another question from John. Can spores travel through space?
Can spores travel through space? Don't know about that, but what I do know is that when weather balloons are sent up into the upper atmosphere, the living thing that is found at the highest altitude are fungal spores. So fungal spores could, what they do, circumnavigate the globe. So when a fungus releases its spores, the majority will drop very locally, and there's logic in that if you think about it, because if I'm able to grow here, my offspring are probably able to grow here as well. But what you also need to be able to is find new places to grow. So if they get carried off by the wind currents into the upper atmosphere, round the globe, they may well find somewhere new. I doubt there would have to be something that caused them to break through the Earth's gravitational pull to get into outer space, but I suspect if they got there, they'd probably survive. So maybe, you know, like all of us, fungi maybe come from outer space originally.
And it's something you probably touched on already, but James Greenway would like to know, what identification book would you recommend?
Okay, so I'm being asked about recommendations for identification books. I think the trick is more than one. And the reason I say that is that they all have good bits and bad bits. So illustrated books can be very good because they will combine various features into one diagram. It's less of a case now, but it used to be that the colours weren't great in some of the printing. However, I would still say that my favourite book, just because it's so well produced, is Roger Phillips' Mushrooms. And Roger Phillips is first and foremost a photographer who got interested in natural history and mushrooms in particular, and he's produced all sorts of books, but he's a photographer and his photographs are just stunningly good. They're really well reproduced. He chooses the species very carefully. The colours are spot on. So he illustrates, I think in his book Mushrooms, he illustrates 1,000, 1,500 species, something like that. But he's chosen the 1,000 species you're most likely to find. So it's a really good starting book, and it's I don't know, 15 quid on Amazon or something like that. Use Amazon Smile if you're going to buy it through Amazon. Go to your local bookshop, is even better. But if you do it on Amazon Smile, make sure you give a donation to Shropshire Wildlife Trust.
That's it in the question department. It's only fair.
Thank you very much for everybody who's watching. I did go out to try and collect a giant puffball for you today. This is a giant puffball. However, the one that I saw that was really, it was beach ball sized. It had rolled down a bank in the high winds, thank you Storm Francis, into a very muddy ditch. So I decided to stick with this little one, which I may well eat tomorrow. Thank you very much. Good night, everybody, and do tune in next Wednesday. Are we off air now?
So that page is still on.
Yeah.